following reading by William Maxwell of So Long, See You Tomorrow was recorded for the American Audio Prose Library in October of 1995 at the Fales Library in New York City, where the author has made his home since the 1930s. William Maxwell, 87 years old at the time of this recording, is one of our most enduring writers, the author of 12 volumes of fiction and nonfiction, most recently, All the Days and Nights, the collected stories of William Maxwell. As listeners already familiar with his work will know, William Maxwell was born in Lincoln, Illinois, where he lived until he moved to Chicago at the age of 14, several years after the death of his beloved mother in the Spanish influenza epidemic of 1918 and his father's subsequent remarriage. After graduating from the University of Illinois and taking his master's degree from Harvard, young William Maxwell went to New York City to make his fortune as a writer. This led him to work as a fiction editor and staff writer at The New Yorker, where from 1936 to 1976 he edited the work of John Cheever, John O'Hara, J.D. Salinger, Harold Brodkey, Delmore Schwartz, Larry Wywoody, Vladimir Nabokov, and many distinguished others, earning along the way a reputation for being, in the words of his colleague Brendan Gill, an odd combination of somebody who is both highly sensitive and hard as nails, which is also a pretty good description of Maxwell's prose style in So Long, See You Tomorrow. The plain-spoken, almost photographic style of this small masterpiece belies its narrative complexity, which is a mix of autobiographical memoir and pure fiction. Maxwell descends into the world of his childhood, where the lives of two boys intersect, and we come to see, through the force of truth-told slant, that their separate stories, one recollected, the other fictionally recreated, are really one. The story of two young lives blown apart by the death of a parent, made whole again through the agency of Maxwell's mature imagination. For the American Audio Prose Library, this is Kay Bonetti. William Maxwell.
Chapter 1, A Pistol Shot. The gravel pit was about a mile east of town and the size of a small lake, and so deep that boys under 16 were forbidden by their parents to swim there. I knew it only by hearsay. It had no bottom, people said, and because I was very much interested in the idea that if you dug a hole straight down anywhere and kept on digging, it would come out in China, I took this to be a literal statement of fact. One winter morning, shortly before daybreak, 3 men loading gravel there heard what sounded like a pistol shot, or they agreed it could have been a car backfiring. Within a few seconds, it had grown light. No one came to the pit through the field that lay alongside it, and they didn't see anyone walking on the road. The sound was not a car backfiring. A tenant farmer named Lloyd Wilson had just been shot and killed, and what they heard was the gun that killed him. At the coroner's inquest, Wilson's uncle, who had lived with him for a number of years and was a man in his late 60s, testified that while he was feeding the horses, he saw his nephew's lantern as he passed on his way to the cow barn. The horse barn and the cow barn were about 500 feet apart. He did not hear the shot, and he was not aware that there was anybody on the farm that morning who did not belong there. The household at that time consisted of Wilson, his 2 little boys, aged 6 and 9, his elderly housekeeper, and the uncle, Fred Wilson. The housekeeper then took the stand and testified that on the last morning of his life, Lloyd Wilson got up at 5:30 as usual, dressed and built 2 fires. While he was waiting for the one in the kitchen range to catch, he stood talking and joking with her. He was in a cheerful mood and left the house whistling. Usually he was through milking and back in the kitchen before she had breakfast ready. At 7 o'clock, knowing that he had to go to town and pick up a man he'd engaged to do some belated corn shucking for him, she told the younger of the two little boys to go and see what was keeping his father so long. He asked for a flashlight, and she peered out into the darkness, and then said he didn't need a flashlight. He could see the lantern shining from the open door of the barn. In a very short while, she heard him coming back to the house. He was crying. When she opened the storm door and called out to him, he said, "Papa's dead. He is sitting there with his eyes open, but he's dead." Who believes children? Brushing him and his story aside, she ran to the barn. Wilson was sitting on a milking stool in the middle stall, his body sunk over against the partition. She caught him by the hand and cried, "Lloyd, what on earth is the matter with you?" thinking he had been stricken with heart failure or perhaps apoplexy. As the child had said, he was sitting there with his eyes open, but he was dead. The housekeeper and Fred Wilson did the necessary things, that is to say, she went back to the house and made a number of telephone calls, and he finished milking the cows and turned them out into the pasture, and then sat beside the body until the undertaker and his assistant came and took it back to town. Rigor mortis had set in, and they had to cut the sleeve of his jacket in order to take off his clothes. They removed the jacket, coat, corduroy vest, and flannel shirt before they saw a small red stain on the undershirt over the heart. In those days, I am talking about the early 1920s, people in Lincoln mostly didn't lock their doors at night, and if they did, it was against the idea of a burglar. One sometimes read in the evening paper that some man had been arrested for disorderly conduct, but that meant drunkenness. Without thinking, I would have said that acts of violence could hardly be expected to flourish in a place where the houses were not widely separated and never enclosed by a high wall, and where it would have been hard to do anything out of the way that somebody, by one accident or another, or from simple curiosity, would not happen to see. But consider the following sentence from a history of Logan County published in 1911. While there have been in the neighborhood of about 50 fatal shooting affrays, very few have occurred where the parties were well known or of considerable standing in the community. As a rule, the shooting, or the knifing or the clubbing, was in a coal miner's shack or a back alley or a lonely farmhouse. But one of the crimes mentioned in that book took place in a house on 10th Street, one street over from the house we lived in when I was a child. What distinguished the murder of Lloyd Wilson from all the others was a fact so shocking that the Lincoln Courier-Herald hesitated several days before printing it. The murderer had cut off the dead man's ear with a razor and carried it away with him. In that pre-Freudian era, people did not ask themselves what the ear might be a substitution for, but merely shuddered. Chapter 2. The Period of Mourning. I very much doubt that I would have remembered for more than 50 years the murder of a tenant farmer I never laid eyes on, if, one, the murderer hadn't been the father of somebody I knew, and two, I hadn't, later on, done something I was ashamed of afterward. This memoir, if that's the right name for it, is a roundabout, futile way of making amends. Before I can go into all that, I have to take up another subject. When my father was getting along in years, and the past began to figure more in his conversation, I asked him one day what my mother was like. I knew what she was like as my mother, but I thought it was time somebody told me what she was like as a person. To my surprise, he said, "That's water over the dam," shutting me up, but also leaving me in doubt because of his abrupt tone of voice. Whether he didn't, after all this time, have any feeling about her much, or did have, but didn't think he ought to, in any case, he didn't feel like talking about her to me. Very few families escape disasters of one kind or another. But in the years between 1909 and 1919, my mother's family had more than its share of them. My grandfather, spending the night in a farmhouse, was bitten on the ear by a rat or a ferret, and died 3 months later of blood poisoning. My mother's only brother was in an automobile accident and lost his right arm. My mother's younger sister poured kerosene on a great fire that wouldn't burn, and set fire to her clothing, and bore the scars of this all the rest of her life. My older brother, when he was 5 years old, got his foot caught in a turning carriage wheel. I was so small when these things happened that either I did not know about them, or else I didn't feel them because they took place at one remove, so to speak. When my brother undressed at night, he left his artificial leg leaning against a chair. It was as familiar to me, since we slept in the same room, as his cap or his baseball gloves. He was not given to feeling sorry for himself, and older people were always careful not to show their sorrow over what had happened to him. What I felt about his affliction was tucked away in my unconscious mind, assuming there is such a thing, where I couldn't get at it. My younger brother was born on New Year's Day at the height of the influenza epidemic of 1918. My mother died 2 days later of double pneumonia. After that, there were no more disasters. The worst that could happen had happened, and the shine went out of everything. Disbelieving, we endured the wreath on the door and the undertaker coming and going, the influx of food, the overpowering odor of white flowers, and all the rest of it, including the first of a series of housekeepers who took care of the baby and sat in my mother's place at mealtime. Looking back, I think it more than likely that long before she ever laid eyes on us, that sallow-faced, flat-chested woman had got the short end of the stick. She may have made a stab at being a mother to my older brother and me, but it would have taken a good deal more than that to break through our resistance. We knew what we had had, and were not going to be taken in by any form of counterfeit affection. My mother's sisters and my father's sisters and my grandmother all watched over us. If they hadn't, I don't know what would have become of us in that sad house where nothing ever changed, where life had come to a standstill. My father was all but undone by my mother's death. In the evening after supper, he walked the floor, and I walked with him, with my arm around his waist. I was 10 years old. He would walk from the living room into the front hall, then turning past the grandfather clock, and on into the library, and from the library into the living room. Or he would walk from the library into the dining room, and then into the living room by another doorway, and back to the front hall. Because he didn't say anything, I didn't either. I only tried to sense, as he was about to turn, which room he was going to next, so we wouldn't bump into each other. His eyes were focused on things not in those rooms, and his face was the color of ashes. From conversations that had taken place in front of me, I knew he was tormented by the belief that he was responsible for what had happened. If he had only taken this or that precaution. It wasn't true, any of it. At a time when the epidemic was raging and people were told to avoid crowds, he and my mother got on a crowded train in order to go to Bloomington, 30 miles away, where the hospital facilities were better than in Lincoln. But even if she had had the baby at home, she still would have caught the flu. My older brother or my father or I would have given it to her. We all came down with it. I had to guess what my older brother was thinking. It was not something he cared to share with me. I studied the look in his hazel eyes and was startled. If I hadn't known, I would have thought that he'd had his feelings hurt by something he was too proud to talk about. It was the most he could manage in the way of concealment. At night we undressed and got into bed and fell asleep without taking advantage of the dark to unburden our hearts to each other. It strikes me as strange now. It didn't then. Though we were very different, he knew me inside out, that is to say, he knew my weaknesses and how to play on them. And this had made me leery about exposing my feelings to him. I also suspect that I had told on him once too often. I have no way of knowing what he might have said. What I didn't say, across the few feet that separated our two beds, was that I couldn't understand how it had happened to us. It seemed like a mistake. And mistakes ought to be rectified, only this one couldn't be. Between the way things used to be and the way they were now was a void that couldn't be crossed. I had to find an explanation other than the real one, which was that we were no more immune to misfortune than anybody else. And the idea that kept recurring to me, perhaps because of that pacing the floor with my father, was that I had inadvertently walked through a door that I shouldn't have gone through, and couldn't get back to the place I hadn't meant to leave. Actually, it was the other way round. I hadn't gone anywhere, and nothing was changed so far as the roof over our heads was concerned. It was just that she was in the cemetery. When I got home from school, I did what I had always done, which was to read, curled up in the window seat in the library or lying flat on my back on the floor, with my feet in a chair, in the darkest corner I could find. The house was full of places to read that fitted me like a glove, and I read the same books over and over. Children tend to derive comfort and support from the totally familiar. An umbrella stand, a glass ashtray backed with brightly colored cigar bands, the fire tongs, anything. With the help of these and other commonplace objects, with the help also of the two big elm trees that shaded the house from the heat of the sun, and the trumpet vine by the back door, and the white lilac bush by the dining room window, and the comfortable wicker porch furniture, and the porch swing that contributed its creak, creak to the sounds of the summer night, I got from one day to the next. My father got from one day to the next by attending faithfully to his job. He was the state agent for a small fire insurance company and traveled from one end of Illinois to the other, inspecting risks and cultivating the friendship of local agents so they would give more business to his company. On Saturday morning, sitting in the library, he would put a check on each inspection slip as he finished glancing over it. And when he had a pile of them, he would hand them to me, and I would sit on the floor and arrange them around me alphabetically by towns, proud that I could be of use to him. He left on Tuesday morning carrying a grip that was heavy with printed forms, and came home Friday afternoon to a household that was seething with problems he was not accustomed to dealing with. His sadness was of the kind that is patient and without hope. He continued to sleep in the bed he and my mother had shared, and tried to act in a way she would have wanted him to, and I suspect that as time passed, he was less and less sure what that was. He gave away her jewelry, and more important to me, her clothes, so I could no longer open her closet door and look at them. I overheard one family friend after another assuring him that there was no cure but time, and though he said, "Yes, I know," I could tell he didn't believe them. Once a week he would wind all the clocks in the house, beginning with the grandfather clock in the front hall. Their minute and hour hands went round dependably, and the light outside corroborated what they said. It was breakfast time, it was late afternoon, It was night, with the darkness pressing against the window panes. What the family friend said is true for some people. For others, the hands of the clock can go round till kingdom come and not cure anything. I don't know by what means my father came to terms with his grief. All I know is that it was more than a year before the color came back into his face, and he could smile when somebody said something funny. When people spoke about my mother, it was always in generalities, her wonderful qualities, her gift for making those around her happy, and so on. They didn't tell me anything I didn't know before. It was as if they couldn't see her clearly for what had happened to her and to us. She didn't like having her picture taken, and all we had was a few snapshots and one formal photograph taken when she was in her early 20s, with her hair piled on top of her head and the black velvet ribbon around her throat. She was only 38 when she died, but she had grown heavy, as women of that period tended to do. There was no question about the mouth or the soft brown eyes. The rest I did not recognize, though I was willing to believe that she had once looked like that. This picture didn't satisfy my father either, and he got the photographer who had taken it to touch it up so she would look more like a mature woman. The result was something I was quite sure my mother had never looked like. Vague and idealized, and as if she might not even remember who we were. My mother sometimes got excited and flew off the handle, but not this woman, who died before her time, leaving a grief-stricken husband and 3 motherless children. The retouched photograph came between me and the face I remembered, and it got harder and harder to recall my mother as she really was. After I couldn't remember any more, except in a general way, what she looked like, I could still remember the sound of her voice, and I clung to that. I also clung to the idea that if things remained exactly the way they were, if we were careful not to take a step in any direction from the place where we were now, we would somehow get back to the way it was before she died. I knew that this was not a rational belief, but the alternative, that when people die they are really gone, and I would never see her again, was more than I could manage then or for a long time afterward. When my father was an old man, he surprised me by remarking that he understood what my mother's death meant to me, but had no idea what to do about it. I think it would have been something if he had just said this. If he didn't, it was possibly because he thought there was nothing he or anybody else could do. Or he may have thought I would reject any help he tried to give me. As a small child, I sometimes had the earache, and I would go to him and ask him to blow cigar smoke in my ear. He would stop talking and draw me toward him, and with his lips almost touching my ear, breathe warm smoke into it. It was as good a remedy as any, and it was physically intimate. One night, I don't know how old I was, 5 or 6 maybe, bedtime came, and I kissed my mother good night as usual, and then went over to my father, and as I leaned toward him, he said I was too old for that anymore. By the standards of that time and that place, I expect I was, but I had wanted to anyway, and how was I to express the feeling I had for him? He didn't say, then or ever. In that moment, my feeling for him changed and became wary and unconfident. All up and down 9th Street there were children I could play with, and sometimes I did, but I preferred to play by myself. On the most beautiful spring day of the year, I stayed in a house reading Tick-Tock of Oz. And when I grew tired of reading, I shut myself up in a darkened room and played with my postcard projector or with a toy theater I had made out of shirt cardboards. All this worried my father, both from the standpoint of my not being outdoors enough, and because if I continued to be interested in such things, how on earth would I support myself when I grew up? There was nothing comical or odd in his thinking this. We are what we are, and he was a businessman, and in his mind there was no better thing that one could be. From time to time, his hand came down on some elaborate fancy, and I had to pick up the pieces and go somewhere where he wasn't, in order to feel cheerful again. If he spoke impatiently to me, or with what seemed to me to be harshness, I could not keep back the tears which added to his annoyance. As he turned away, I had the feeling he had washed his hands of me. Was I not the kind of little boy he wanted to have? He didn't say that either. It is hard enough for adults to keep their emotional reactions in something like balance. Children simply feel what they feel, and I knew I was not the apple of my father's eye. We were both creatures of the period. I doubt if the heavy businessman father and the oversensitive artistic son syndrome exists anymore. Fathers have become sympathetic and kiss their grown sons when they feel like it. And who knows what oversensitive is, considering all there is to be sensitive to. When a sufficient number of months had been torn off the calendar so that my mother's friends felt they could invite my father to their dinner parties, they did, and he got dressed up and went. They were matchmaking, of course, and like all matchmakers, had mixed motives. I doubt if he needed their help. He was still only in his early 40s, and he had always been handsome and liked women, and it would have been strange if he hadn't found somebody who was willing to love him. I had no comprehension whatever of the sexual and emotional needs of a man of his age. He was simply my father, and I assumed that for the rest of his life he would be faithful to my mother's memory, is how I had heard grown people express it. While he was having his social life, I was having mine. Our room at school decided to have a Halloween party, and there was a question of where to have it. I offered our house, and the offer was accepted. When I told my father, he shook his head doubtfully and asked what I planned to do. I said I was going to carve a pumpkin and put some cornstalks around in the living room. He didn't think the party was at all a good idea. It would mean extra work for the housekeeper, and next time I'd better ask before I did something like that. Since I had committed myself, I could go ahead with it, provided it was confined to the empty maid's room and they used the back stairs. My mother wasn't there to tell him that this was unthinkable, and so that's what happened. Deeply embarrassed, I led the teacher and my classmates through rooms that were brightly lit and had always been so hospitable, through the dining room to the pantry, and up the narrow, uninviting back stairs. Nobody seemed to find this in any way strange. I don't think it was much of a Halloween party. What has stayed in my mind all these years is a scene that occurred by the laundry basket in the back hall. The teacher had been chosen to be the victim, and sat down on a chair and allowed herself to be blindfolded. At that point, ideas of propriety made me hesitate. I motioned to one of the girls who took my place. When the teacher removed the blindfold, she was smiling with pleasure because she thought a young boy had kissed her. In telling me that he was going to be married, my father was as gentle as he knew how to be. He didn't expect me to offer any objection, and wouldn't have been deflected from his purpose if I had. A year or two before this, at the country club, on a summer day, wandering idly near the caddy house, I came upon a sight I didn't understand. I thought at first he was some new kind of animal. Then I retreated in horror. What I was looking at was a snake in the act of swallowing a frog that was too large and wouldn't go down. Neither would the idea that another woman was not only going to sit in my mother's place at the dinner table, but also take her place in my father's heart. Where a hardier boy would have run away from home or got in trouble with the police, I sat with my nose in a book so I wouldn't have to think about things I didn't like and couldn't prevent happening. It wasn't enough for me or for my older brother and my younger brother and me to slip through that door to the way things used to be when the time came. My mother would expect us to bring my father with us, and if he was married to another woman, how could we? We had moved from our fixed position, and there was now no possibility of getting back to the way things were before she died. I could not tell whether the heavy feeling in my chest had to do with what might happen or with what had already happened and was irremediable. The kindergarten, run by Miss Lena Moose and Miss Lucy Sheffield, was on the second floor of a building just off the courthouse square. And the young woman who became my stepmother used to go from house to house at 9 o'clock in the morning collecting the children. When we were all assembled, she walked us downtown. She must have been in her early 20s then. As a child, she had lived on 9th Street, though she didn't anymore. At noon, on the day of my mother's funeral, when we went into the dining room, she was there. I sat down at the table, but I could not eat. My throat was blocked from crying. She came and stood behind my chair and talked to me and urged me to eat some of the baked potato on my plate. For her sake, because she was young and pretty, and because I had always liked her, I managed to do it. The taste of that baked potato has remained with me all the rest of my life. In fairy tales, the coming of a stepmother is never regarded as anything but a misfortune. Presumably, this is not because of the great number of second wives who were unkind to the children of their husband's first marriage, though examples of this could be found, but because of the universal resentment on the children's part of an outsider, so that for the father to remarry is an act of betrayal not only of the dead mother, but of them, no matter what the stepmother is like. What strange and unlikely things are washed up on the shore of time. I have in my possession a tattered photograph album full of snapshots of my stepmother as a young woman. Very pretty and sweet she was, with a fur muff and a picture hat, and her skirts almost to the floor. There are pictures of her with friends, with her mother and sister, with one or another of her 4 brothers, with elderly relatives on the front stoop of a turn-of-the-century house in, I think, Boston. There are 2 group pictures taken by a local photographer of a masquerade party, one with masks and one without, so that you can see who the pirate, the clown, the Columbine, etc. were. Half the people there I knew when I was growing up. And then more pictures of my stepmother in Washington, D.C. during the First World War, with a thin-faced man in an army uniform whom she was in love with at the time but did not marry. Back in Lincoln, holding her sister's baby, and so on. What beautiful clothes, what glorious automobiles, what good times. At the beginning and end of the album, pasted in what must have been blank places since they run counter to the sequence, are a dozen pictures of my father, except for the one where he is standing with a string of fish spread out on a rock beside him. He is always in a group of people. He has a golf stick in his hand, or he is smoking a pipe, or he is wearing a bathing suit and has one arm around my stepmother's waist and the other around a woman I don't recognize. And looking at these faded snapshots, I see the child that survives in me seized with a pang that I am old enough to be that man's father, and he has been dead for nearly 20 years, and yet it troubles me that he was happy. Why? In some way, his happiness was at that time, and forever after, it would seem, a threat to me. It was not the kind of happiness that children are included in. But why should that trouble me now? I do not even begin to understand it. If I had, by some supernatural sleight of hand, managed to pull off that trick, and brought my mother back from the cemetery, and if we had continued to live the way we did before, we would have found ourselves on an island in a river of change. For it was the year 1921, and women had begun to cut off their hair and wear their skirts above their knees and drink gin out of silver flasks in public. Now and then one of them drank too much and had to be taken home. The gossips had a great deal to shake their heads over. In the light of what followed, the 20s seem on the whole a charming, carefree period. So far as good manners are concerned, it was the beginning of the end. When my mother went riding with my father on Sunday morning, she rode side saddle, think of it, and came out of the house and down the steps of the front porch in a divided skirt that swept the cement walk. I tried to imagine her with bobbed hair and her skirts above her knees, and I failed utterly. It was still possible to think, as my father did, that the present was in every way an improvement over the past, and that the future was bound to be even more satisfactory. He also believed in keeping up with the times. When Prohibition came in, he announced that he was ready to obey the law and give up drinking, by which he meant a glass of beer or a shot of bourbon in masculine company. When it turned out that other people were not going to do this, he made his own gin and bought rotgut whiskey from a bootlegger named Coonhound Johnny, like his friends. On one occasion, he even overshot the mark. Friday afternoons, I went to dancing school and pushed girls around in the one-step, the foxtrot, and the waltz. They held themselves at arm's length, their backs stiff as a ramrod, their manners remote. The dancing teacher was young and animated, and something under 5 feet tall, which meant that she was my height even though she wore very high heels. There was also a class for adults on Thursday evenings to which my father and stepmother went before they were married. One night they put their cheeks together and did a new dance that they had been practicing in private. It was called the toddle, and everybody stopped to look at them, and the dancing teacher, very red in the face, asked them to leave the floor. It is characteristic of my father that though he was angry at her and never went back, he did not remove me from the children's class. On Friday afternoon, the dancing teacher kept me after the other boys and girls had gone. She was in trouble, though she didn't quite manage to say what it was. Did she sense that I was half on her side and nobody else much was? She had done the right thing without stopping to think that the two people involved were of good family, and she was a grass widow with 2 small children to support, and from out of town. She may not, in fact, even have known who was and who wasn't of good family. I felt sorry for her, as I would have for anybody in tears, and disloyal to my father as I stood there listening to the things she said about him, and embarrassed that he was the object of scandal. One of the things my mother loved about my father was that he was a natural musician. Hoping that this talent might have been inherited, she arranged for my older brother to take piano lessons from a nun who taught music in the Catholic school. When I was 6, I accompanied him to the house where the nuns lived for my first music lesson. Sister Mary and niece showed me where to put my hands on the keyboard, and I looked up at her teeth, which were frightfully crooked, and burst into tears. She told my brother to bring me back when I was 7, by which time she was wearing false teeth. They were not crooked, and I could look at her with equanimity. I was not musical, and I didn't like to practice. What I did like was the lives of the composers doled out to me, one at a time, in the form of unbound sheets of printed matter. It had to be folded and sewed together at the spine, and a perforated sheet of illustrations to be pasted in at the appropriate places. In the first of these books, I read how Johann Sebastian Bach's wicked elder brother was jealous of his talent and wouldn't let him have access to the music he wanted. So he got up in the night and copied it by moonlight, ruining his eyesight. I formed an attachment to the young put-upon Johann Sebastian Bach, and after him to Handel and his water music, and Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven and Schubert and Schumann and Mendelssohn, and Wagner's operas, and classical music in general. It didn't improve my playing. Flat, my mother would call out from the next room when I was practicing at home. E flat, not E natural. And I would get up from the piano stool and go look at the clock in the front hall. My father kept a small Victrola on top of the upright piano in the living room, and after dinner, having played a new record through 2 or 3 times while he figured out the chords, he was off. He had it. He played ragtime and songs from the musicals of the period. He had a beautiful touch, and people loved to hear him. One day he sat down at the piano with me and tried to teach me how to play by ear. I didn't understand one word he was saying. It gave him no pleasure to hear me stumble through the shepherd boy's prayer, and also he wanted me to like his kind of music. So when I was 12, without inquiring how I felt about it, he took me away from Sister Mary and niece and Bach and Handel and Haydn, and arranged for me to take lessons from a young married woman who played the organ in the Catholic Church and was my stepmother's closest friend. The piece she gave me to learn at my father's suggestion was Alice Blue Gown. I liked her, but I came to have a deep dislike for that inane song. Because he was finishing out a period of mourning, which in those days had to be 3 years, roughly, or there was talk, he and my stepmother waited. She was in California for a while, and when I went for my music lesson, I would be given a fat envelope that would come in the mail inside another envelope addressed to my music teacher. Nobody explained that this was so the housekeeper couldn't steam the envelope open and read what was inside. Instead, they acted as though it was the most natural thing in the world for a 12-year-old boy to be bringing a love letter home to his father. The reason life is so strange is that so often people have no choice, but in this case, I think convenience entered into it. I mean, my father could have rented a box at the post office. He may have been deterred by the fact that if he was seen entering and leaving the post office and taking mail out of a box, people would very soon have guessed why. So in short, he had no choice either about that or about selling the house, which was so full of associations with my mother. In a matter of 2 or 3 weeks after he put it on the market, it was bought by a man who'd had enough of farming and wanted to live in town. One day while I was in school, the moving men came, and what furniture my father hadn't managed to sell or give away ended up in a much smaller house that he had rented on an unpaved street out near the edge of town. I went straight home from school to the new house. Though as a grown man I have often stood and looked at the old house, I have never been inside it since that day when a great many objects that I remember and would like to be reunited with disappeared without a trace. Victorian walnut sofas and chairs that my fingers had absently traced every knob and scroll of. Mahogany tables, worn oriental rugs, gilt mirrors, pictures, big square books full of photographs that I knew by heart. If they hadn't disappeared then, they would have on some other occasion, life being, as Ortega y Gasset somewhere remarks, in itself and forever shipwreck. The rented house had no yard to speak of. The porch steps were 10 feet from the front sidewalk, and our house and the house next door were identical. The bites that woke me in the night proved to be bedbugs concealed under a loose corner of the wallpaper, and the exterminator took care of them. My father probably thought that since we were not going to stay there, it didn't matter too much what the house was like. Or there may not, at that moment, have been anything better. I used to stand and compare the two identical houses detail by detail, the way you compare repeats in wallpaper, hoping to find some small difference. I did not so much miss the old house as blot it completely out of my mind. We had gone down in the world, and there didn't seem to be anything to do but make the best of it. 9th Street had the air of having been there since the beginning of time. Generations of children had grown up there, leaving their bicycles where people could fall over them, making leaf houses, climbing trees, playing Run Sheep Run on summer evenings. The unpaved street we were now living on had no past and no future, but only a wan present in which it was hard to think of anything to do. One evening in October, my father and Grace McGrath came down the stairs in her sister's house and were married on the landing by the Catholic priest, who couldn't marry them in a church because my father was a Protestant. I was the only person present under the age of 30. My older brother was away at college, my younger brother asleep in his crib. Now was the moment to forget about that door I had walked through without thinking, and about the void that could sometimes be bridged in dreams, and about the way things used to be when my mother was alive. Instead, I clung to them more tightly than ever, even as I was being drawn, willy-nilly, into my father's new life. Chapter 3, The New House. The small towns in central Illinois nearly all owe their existence to the coming of the railroads in the decade before the Civil War. I have always had the impression that Lincoln is in some way different from the others, but perhaps that's only because I lived there. It is the county seat and has 2 coal mines now worked out. It has never had any sizable factories and owes its modest prosperity to the surrounding farmland. In the year 1921, the shade trees that everywhere lined the residential streets had had time to come full size and made the town seem older than it actually was. It was not easy to tell when the houses were built because their age was so frequently disguised by subsequent additions, and so they seemed timeless and as inseparably a part of the people who lived in them as their voices or their names or the way they combed their hair. My father found most old things oppressive, but especially old houses with high ceilings and odd-shaped rooms that opened one out of another, offering a pleasant vista that required a great deal of coal to heat in the harsh Illinois winters. Intending to escape all this by building, he bought a double lot in Park Place, a subdivision so recently laid out that the trees were only 5 feet tall and had to be staked against the north wind. All but 2 of the existing houses were on the right-hand side of the street, facing a cow pasture that I think has not been built on to this day. The building lots were narrow, and the houses much closer together than they were in the old part of town. But there was an ornamental brick gateway leading into the street, and a grass plot down the center, and it was fashionable. In present-day Lincoln, it is fashionable to live clear out in the country, surrounded by cornfields. My father and my stepmother had seen a stucco house in Bloomington that they liked, and they got an architect to copy the exterior, and then the 3 of them fiddled with the interior plans until they were satisfactory. I was shown on the blueprints where my room was going to be. In a short time, the cement foundation was poured, and the framing was up, and you could see the actual size and shape of the rooms. I used to go there after school and watch the carpenters hammering. Bong, 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 kapong, 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 kapong. They may have guessed that I was waiting for them to pick up their tools and go home so I could climb around on the scaffolding. But they didn't tell me I couldn't do this, or in fact, pay any attention to me at all. And I had the agreeable feeling as I went from one room to the next by walking through the wall instead of the doorway, or looked up and saw the blue sky through the rafters, that I had found a way to get around the way things were. When, wandering through the Museum of Modern Art, I come upon the piece of sculpture by Alberto Giacometti with the title Palace at 4 a.m., I always stand and look at it, partly because it reminds me of my father's new house in its unfinished state, and partly because it is so beautiful. It is about 30 inches high and sufficiently well known that I probably don't need to describe it, but anyway, it is made of wood, and there are no solid walls, only thin uprights and horizontal beams. There is the suggestion of a classic pediment and of a tower. Flying around in a room at the top of the palace, there is a queer-looking creature with the head of a monkey wrench. A bird, a cross between a male ballet dancer and a pterodactyl. Below it, in a kind of freestanding closet, the backbone of some animal. To the left, backed by 3 off-white parallelograms, what could be an imposing female figure or one of the more important pieces of a chess set. And in about the position a basketball ring would occupy, a vertical, hollowed-out, spatulate shape with a ball in front of it. It is all terribly spare and strange, but no stranger than the artist's account of how it came into being. This object took shape little by little in the late summer of 1932. It revealed itself to me slowly, the various parts taking their exact form and their precise place within the whole. By autumn, it had attained such reality that its actual execution in space took no more than 1 day. It is related without any doubt to a period in my life that had come to an end a year before, when for 6 whole months, hour after hour, was passed in the company of a woman who, concentrating all life in herself, magically transformed my every moment. We used to construct a fantastic palace at night. Days and nights have the same color, as if everything happened just before daybreak. Throughout the whole time I never saw the sun. A very fragile palace of matchsticks. At the slightest false move, a whole section of this tiny construction would collapse. We would always begin it over again. I don't know why it came to be inhabited by a spinal column in a cage. The spinal column this woman sold me one of the very first nights I met her on the street, and by one of the skeleton birds that she saw the very night before the morning in which our life together collapsed. The skeleton birds that flutter with cries of joy at 4 o'clock in the morning, very high above the pool of clear green water, where extremely fine white skeletons of fish float in the great unroofed hall. In the middle there rises the scaffolding of a tower, perhaps unfinished, or, since its top is collapsed, perhaps also broken. On the other side there appeared the statue of a woman in which I recognized my mother, just as she appears in my earliest memories. The mystery of her long black dress touching the floor troubled me. It seemed to me like a part of her body, and aroused in me a feeling of fear and confusion. I seem to remember that I went to the new house one winter day and saw snow descending through the attic to the upstairs bedrooms. It could also be that I never did any such thing, for I am fairly certain that in a snapshot album I've lost track of, there was a picture of the house taken in the circumstances I have just described. And it is possible that I am remembering that rather than an actual experience. What we, or at any rate what I, refer to confidently as memory, meaning a moment, a scene, a fact that has been subjected to a fixative and thereby rescued from oblivion, is really a form of storytelling that goes on continually in the mind and often changes with the telling. Too many conflicting emotional interests are involved for life ever to be wholly acceptable, and possibly it is the work of the storyteller to rearrange things so that they conform to this end. In any case, in talking about the past, we lie with every breath we draw. Before the stairway was in, there was a gaping hole in the center of the house, and you had to use the carpenter's rickety ladder to get to the second floor. One day, I looked down through this hole and saw Cletus Smith standing on a pile of lumber looking at me. I suppose I said, "Come on up." Anyway, he did. We stood looking out at the unlit street lamp through a square opening that someday was going to be a window. And then we climbed up another ladder and walked along horizontal 2x6s with our arms outstretched, teetering like circus acrobats on the high wire. We could have fallen all the way through to the basement and broken an arm or a leg, but we didn't. Boys don't need much of an excuse to get on well together, if they get on at all. I was glad for his company, and pleased when he turned up the next day. If I saw him now the way he was then, I don't know that I would recognize him. I seem to remember his smile, and that he had large hands and feet for a boy of 13. And Cletus Smith isn't his real name. Did I know him because he was in my room at school? I try to picture him standing at the blackboard and can't. It is so long ago. Were we in the same Boy Scout troop? which would have meant that at some time during that fall we had studied the Scout Manual together and practiced tying reef knots and clove hitches and running bowlines, and considered what merit badges we would try for next? I don't know the answer. I only know that I knew him from somewhere, and that we played together in that unfinished house day after day, risking our necks and breathing in the rancid odor of sawdust and shavings and fresh-cut lumber. 9th Street was an extension of home and perfectly safe. Nobody ever picked on me there. When I passed beyond 9th Street, it could be rough going. The boys in the 8th grade dominated the schoolyard before school and at recess time. They were by turns good-natured in a patronizing way, or mean or foul-mouthed about girls, or single-mindedly bent on improving their proficiency in some sport. Sometimes they would go to the trouble of twisting the younger boy's arm behind his back, or put a foot out and trip him as he ran past. And if he fell and hurt himself, they were happy for a whole quarter of an hour afterward, but their attention seldom settled on any one boy for very long. Looking back, it seems clear enough that I brought my difficulties on myself. To begin with, I was as thin as a stick. In any kind of competitive game, my mind froze and I became half paralyzed. The baseball could be counted on to slip through my over-anxious fingers. Nobody wanted me on their team. I was a character. I also had the unfortunate habit, when called on in class, of coming up with the right answer. It won me a smile of approval from the teacher, and it was nice to see my name on the honor roll. It was not nice to be chased home from school by 2 coal miners' sons who were in the same room with me, but only because they could not escape from the truant officer. Nowhere was I safe against them, neither in the classroom, where their eyes were always on me, or in the schoolyard, where they danced around me, pushing me off balance and trying to get me to fight back so they could clean up on me. All this took place in plain sight of everybody, all the boys I had grown up with, and no hand was ever raised in my defense. Nobody ever came to my rescue. I expect partly because they had their own vulnerabilities. I did not want to be singled out for attack, but obviously there was something about me that invited it. Since I did not know what it was, I couldn't do anything to change it. And any emotion I felt, physical inadequacy, fear, humiliation, the whole repertoire of the adolescent, showed in my face. I was such easy game that I wonder that their pleasure in tormenting me lasted as long as it did. When they were 14, they dropped out of school, and I never saw them again. Where else could they have gone but down in the mine with their fathers? If somebody told me they had contracted black lung, I don't know that I could manage to be sorry. The gap between my older brother and me was too great for me to emulate his pleasures or contribute to them, and I would have been glad for a brother nearer my own age to defend me when I got in trouble and to do things with. At about this time, one of my mother's friends, a woman I knew but not very well, invited me to come to her house after school on Friday and stay until Sunday afternoon. She had a son who was a year or 2 older than I was, and everything a boy that age ought to be: open and easy with adults, bright in school, and beyond being pushed around by his contemporaries. I slept in the same room with him, and I was with him all day Saturday and Sunday. Without any experience to go on, I tried to be a good guest. Most of the time, he was friendly, and then suddenly he would mutter something under his breath that I couldn't quite hear, and that I knew from a heaviness in my heart was the word sissy. I ignored it, not knowing what else to do, not having enough experience of the world to take my toothbrush and pajamas and go home, leaving him to explain to his mother why I wasn't there. At bedtime, standing by the wide-open window of his room, he had me do setting up exercises with him. He was patient when I didn't do them right, and also funny. And it was so nice to be doing something with another boy for a change. But then he muttered that word under his breath that I wasn't supposed to be able to say he had actually said. He was exactly the kind of boy I would have liked to be, and I was ready to imitate him in any way I could. One minute I was encouraged to do this, and the next I felt, I was made to feel, that he despised me. Probably all it amounted to was that his mother had decided on this act of kindness without consulting him, and he was angry because my being there had spoiled his Saturday. In any case, the point I am trying to make is that it was a new experience for me to have the companionship of another boy day after day. Whatever I suggested doing, we did. I never asked Cletus if there wasn't something he'd rather be doing, because he was always ready to do what I wanted to do. It occurs to me now that he was not very different from an imaginary playmate. When I was with him, if I said something the boys in the schoolyard would have jeered at, he let the opportunity pass and went on, carefully teetering with one foot in front of the other, or at most, without glancing in my direction, which would have endangered his balance, nodded. I suppose he must have liked me somewhat, or he wouldn't have been there, and he was glad for my companionship. He didn't act as if there was some other boy waiting for him to turn up. He must have understood that I was going to live in this house when it was finished, but it didn't occur to me to wonder where he lived. When I was a child, I told my mother everything. After she died, I learned it was better to keep some things to myself. My father represented authority, which meant, to me, that he could not also represent understanding. And because there was an element of cruelty in my older brother's teasing, as of course there is in all teasing, I didn't trust him, though I perfectly well could have, about larger matters. Anyway, I didn't tell Cletus about my shipwreck as we sat looking down on the whole neighborhood, and he didn't tell me about his. When the look of the sky informed us that it was getting along toward supper time, we climbed down and said, "So long, and see you tomorrow," and went our separate ways in the dusk. And one evening, this casual parting turned out to be for the last time. We were separated by that pistol shot. There was never any real doubt about who had killed Lloyd Wilson. The only person who had any reason to do it was Clarence Smith, Cletus's father. Among the things that Cletus failed to tell me was the fact that he had grown up in the country. He had only been living in town a few months. His mother had sued his father for a divorce, the grounds being extreme and repeated cruelty. His father then filed a cross bill charging her with infidelity and naming Lloyd Wilson, who lived on the adjoining farm, as correspondent. The Lincoln Courier-Herald was and is a self-respecting small-town newspaper, and it did not feel called upon to provide the salacious details which are safely buried in the court records. I think it highly unlikely that Cletus was present at the divorce trial. How much did he know? Enough, probably. Enough so that it was preferable to play with a boy he hardly knew than with somebody he might be tempted to confide in, if there was any such person. When the divorce proceedings went against him, Cletus's father sold his lease and gave up farming and moved in with Cletus's grandparents in town. He was depressed and given to fits of weeping, and he could not keep from talking about his troubles. Men who had known him for many years took to crossing over to the other side of the street when they saw him coming. Lloyd Wilson confessed to his two brothers that he lived in fear of an attack on his life. They told him he ought to leave town immediately. Like a figure in a dream, he took all the steps he should have taken, but in slow motion. He went to see the woman whose land he farmed and asked to be released from his contract, which did not expire until March. He consulted a lawyer. On the morning that he was killed, he left the barn door open wide so as to catch the morning light when it came. The light from his lantern must have fallen just short of the toe of the murderer's boot. I assumed that I knew all this once, since it was published in the evening paper, and I was old enough to read. In the course of time, the details of the murder passed from my mind, and what I thought happened was so different from what actually did happen that it might almost have been something I made up out of whole cloth. And I might have gone right on thinking that Cletus's father had come home unexpectedly and found Cletus's mother in bed with a man and killed them both. But one day, as if I had suddenly broken through a brick wall, I realized that there are always sources of information about the past other than one's own recollection, and that I didn't need to remain in total ignorance about something that interested me so deeply. I wrote to my step-cousin Tom Perry and asked him if he could dig up for me those issues of the Courier-Herald that had anything in them about the murder of Lloyd Wilson. He reported back to me that the Courier file, the Herald was dropped a long time ago, did not go back to the year 1922, and that the public library had destroyed its file 6 months before, and what I'd better do was apply to the Illinois State Historical Society in Springfield. It was as if I was inquiring into the funeral of Abraham Lincoln. But anyway, I did as he said, and the Historical Society sent me from its microfilm library photostatic copies, not always entirely legible, of 8 issues of a newspaper once as familiar to me as the back of my hand. It was, of course, much more than I had asked for. A small segment of the past, remote and yet in perfect focus, like something seen through the wrong end of a pair of binoculars. Ads for movies starring Norma Talmadge and Wallace Reed. Good quality of men's suits at Grisham's clothing store at $7, and many other things equally hard to believe. I don't know where the office and printing plant of the Lincoln Courier is now, only that it isn't where it used to be on North Kickapoo Street, half a block from the courthouse square. Several of the pieces about the murder were written by the editor, whom I remember as a high-strung, dark-haired man with a green eye shade and a cigarette in the corner of his mouth. His stories give the impression of being dashed off in the last minutes before the paper went to press. That is to say, they are repetitious and disordered, and full of not very acute speculation. Also of cliches and reticences, which the ideas of the period no doubt required. People are quoted as saying things I have trouble believing they actually said, at least in those words. I am reasonably sure, for example, that Cletus's father did not say to a man he met on the street the day before the murder, "I am broken and a failure, and I have nothing for which to live." Nobody I know in the Middle West has ever gone out of his way to avoid ending a sentence with a preposition. But it isn't fair in any case to blame that overworked, small-town newspaper editor, for not writing as well as Roughhead, especially since I am indebted to him for any knowledge I have of what happened. The sheriff was on the point of taking some prisoners to the courthouse for trial when the undertaker called him. The deputy sheriff and the coroner went out to the Wilson farm, and Fred Wilson showed them the stall Lloyd Wilson was in, the pail that had only a little milk in it, the milking stool, the gloves that he always wore when he was milking, and it was still on his hands when they found him. Near the door of the cow barn, the two men from town saw some footprints, which they covered with boards so they would stay fresh. All morning, search parties beat over the muddy fields and along the banks of a creek that ran through both farms. The bloodhounds arrived from Springfield by train and were taken to the scene of the crime. 200 people were there waiting for them. The footprints were uncovered and the dogs were led to the cow barn and unleashed. Sniffing, they circled an implement shed and a haystack and returned to the barn, and then they jumped a barbed wire fence and took off with a pack of excited men running after them. Just before the dogs got to the farmhouse Clarence Smith had recently moved out of, they turned aside at a gate and followed the lane out to the public road. After pausing at the mailbox, they crossed over to the other side of the road and lost the scent. Twice they were led back to the cow barn and let loose. The first time, they went into the yard of the Smith farm and up onto the porch. The second time, they turned aside again into a cornfield and followed a trail of footprints until they ended up on the hard road, a quarter of a mile west of the lane. Clarence Smith had sold his lease to a younger man named James Walker. After the bloodhounds were taken back to town, Walker came out of the farmhouse and walked out to the public road. A handful of men lingered by the entrance to the lane, and moved by a floating curiosity, they gathered around him while he pulled down the flap of the mailbox. What were they expecting? At most a letter or two that they would not be allowed to read, and yesterday's Courier Herald. In the mailbox was an object so startling that they all stepped back and waited. James Walker took the gold watch out of the mailbox and opened the case and found the initials C.S. It could only be Clarence Smith's watch. But when was it left there, and for what reason? James Walker drove into town and turned it over to the sheriff, who considered the possibility that it was a plant put there by someone other than Clarence Smith to make it appear that he was the murderer. That evening, the sheriff went to the house of Clarence Smith's parents and learned that they had no idea where their son was. Neither had anyone else. He was last seen leaving the Grand Theater at 10:45 on the night before Lloyd Wilson was killed. The state's attorney didn't issue a warrant charging Cletus's father with the murder. He was merely wanted for questioning. The description sent to the police throughout the state reads: age 40 years, height 5 feet 7 inches, weight 165 pounds, light brown hair, slightly bald. Neighbors reported that they had seen a strange automobile waiting near the Wilson farm on the night before the murder. One of them said that the automobile waited in the lane just off the hard road for at least 2 hours. He saw it for the last time at about 9 o'clock, just before he went to bed. Another neighbor said that the automobile was not in the lane but at the edge of the hard road, and that it was standing with the lights turned off. Since Clarence Smith did not own a car, This raised the question of whether he might have had an accomplice. There was a rumor that he was seen boarding a trolley car that ran between Peoria, Lincoln, and Springfield on the day of the murder. Also, that he had registered at a hotel in Springfield and that same night had received a long-distance telephone call there. Given the chance to believe something so interesting, people did, though the hotel denied that he had been there, and the person who saw him board the trolley never came forward. The rumor that he had a large sum of money on his person when he disappeared couldn't have been true either, since the money from the sale of his lease could all be accounted for. There was another angle to the case that the Courier felt obliged to consider. In the spring of the year before he was killed, Lloyd Wilson's wife left him, taking their 4 girls, the youngest of whom was a baby 11 months old, and moved to town. She did not divorce him, but got a legal separation. By the terms of this agreement, he had to pay her $9,000, which in 1921 was a lot of money. My father's new house only cost $12,000, including the land it was built on. The settlement Lloyd Wilson made on his wife may have represented all the money he had. I don't know what she looked like. Most farm women of her age were reduced by hard work and frequent childbearing to a common denominator of plainness. I fancy, as people used to say when I was a child, I fancy that this was true of Lloyd Wilson's wife, and that it was not true of Cletus's mother. But there is no warrant for my thinking this, and the simple truth is that though so much is made of the woman's beauty in love stories, passion does not require it. Plato's idea that lovers were originally one person, the 2 parts having become separated and desiring to be joined, is as good an explanation as any of what cannot, in the mind of an outsider, ever be convincingly accounted for. The names and ages of the Wilson children were printed in the paper. Probably through happenstance, the names and ages of Clarence Smith's were not. Cletus's mother had been an orphan and was brought up by an aunt and uncle who lived in town. When she left Cletus's father, she moved back to the house she grew up in. The Courier-Herald gives the address, and I asked my cousin to see if there was a house at that address now. He reported back that there was, and that it was one of a row of frame houses opposite the fairgrounds. Somewhat down at the heels, he said, and painted white, and like a lot of other small houses in town. What the newspaper refers to as the estrangement occurred during the summer after Wilson's wife left him. A year ago, the Courier-Herald goes on to say, there were no better friends than Wilson and Smith. They were often in town together. If Smith bought a cigar for himself, he also bought one for Wilson, who did the same. In an argument, they stuck up for each other against all comers, and people often spoke about what bosom friends they were. Smith is considered by people who knew him to be a quiet, reserved man. The only photograph I have ever seen of him, or of Lloyd Wilson, was printed on the front page of the Courier-Herald. Since it is a photostatic copy, black and white, or rather brown and white, are reversed. Even so, they look enough alike to be taken for brothers. No doubt Cain and Abel loved each other in their way, quite as much as, or even more than, David and Jonathan. There are many questions I did not find the answer to by reading those old newspapers. For example, from whom did Cletus's mother learn about the murder, and how soon? And what happened then? Hysterics in front of her two sons? And what about the 6-year-old child who was sent to the barn to see what was keeping his father so long? Were he and his brother peering out through a lace curtain when the bloodhounds went baying across the fields in pursuit of the man who had killed their father? Or did the housekeeper draw them away from the window? She was a country woman, and you don't see such sights every day. Chances are that all three of them were peering out of the window, unless the little boy's mother had already come for them. For several days, new details kept turning up. It is said on high authority that Wilson and Mrs. Smith corresponded frequently since the Smith divorce last fall, and during the time that Smith was paying alimony to his former wife. It is believed that Smith knew of this alleged fact and brooded over the situation. Mrs. Smith is said to have been afraid of her former husband, and this fear is believed to have been communicated to Wilson. Sheriff Aarons called in a former farmhand of Smith's who had testified for him during the trial. This man had been working in the Coonsburg vicinity, had been regularly employed there, and had not seen Smith since a week ago Saturday night, when he came out of the bathroom of the local barber shop and saw Smith waiting for a shave, and so on. James Walker told a reporter from the Courier-Herald that one day, shortly after Clarence Smith left the farm and he took possession, he came out of the woodshed and saw Smith standing on the porch. Walker said he was all by himself at the time and glad to have somebody to talk to. When Smith said, "Do you mind if I have a look around?" he said, "Go ahead, help yourself," as anybody would under the circumstances. But when Smith came back again, a few days later, and spent a long time in the barn and then went out into one shed after another, Walker grew uneasy. If Smith had lost something, why didn't he say what it was? It turned out that Walker himself had lost something instead, a small anvil. He was positive he had brought it with him when he moved, and so far as he knew, there was no way Clarence Smith could have carried it off with him. But neither could the anvil have walked off by itself. James Walker wrote to his wife and asked her to join him immediately. And after that, Clarence Smith didn't come any more.